My Brexit story for you tonight begins many moons ago when I was a young reporter in regional independent television in the East Coast fishing town of Grimsby. And at that time, the European Union brought out a set of new regulations governing and tightening up hygiene precautions for people serving food. And one of the regulations was that you had to wear a net over your hair if you were involved in serving food to the public. So you can go into a supermarket to the delicatessen counter and you see people kind of wearing hairnets. In fact, the fashion for the hipster look recently in Britain has meant that some of the male shop assistants also have beard nets, which is quite an amusing sight. But at the time, this new initiative by the European Union was written up in the Eurosceptic right-wing British press as something that would also include people including fishermen, trawlermen. So we took our TV camera down to Grimsby docks with these kind of, a packet of these pink hairnets that we bought from the market, and we kind of passed them over to these unsuspecting, horny-handed sons of toil who obligingly kind of placed them on their heads and grimaced for the camera, gave their responses. And it was great telly, but it was actually a complete furphy because the regulation was never designed or intended to apply to fishermen as they're only handling the raw material. But that was jolly good for my career, but it wasn't very good for the standard of debate and discourse about Britain's EU membership. So I tried to make up for it and fast forward a few years, and I moved sideways to be a programme presenter still in regional ITV, and the northeast of England, in the northeast of England, and the region was to be visited by John Major. And John Major was widely derided at the time, but as an incumbent of 10 Downing Street, of course, we now realise what a towering figure of intellectual acuity and moral integrity actually was, by comparison. Prior to the arrival of John Major, of course, I've been out kind of gathering material, gathering other perspectives, including from a group called Surfers Against Sewage. Surfers Against Sewage, and their chief concern was to see the implementation of EU regulations for the treatment of sewage in order to avoid running into it as they bobbed around on the waves off Saltburn Beach in the northeast of England. So it was that I themed my major interview with the Tory Prime Minister on the strangely apt idea of turds floating through the water off the coast of Britain. So that, I think, contains a point about the European Union, which is really not abundantly well understood or appreciated in Britain. It is, in essence, a set of institutions whose prime function is regulation. Prime function is regulation. In order to ensure standards about protections for people at work, protections for the environment, safeguarding consumers and so forth. In fact, it's that character of the European Union which has been responsible over the years for the switch within the British Labour Party. About 35 years ago, the British Labour Party entered a general election campaign in 1983, committed to pulling Britain out of what was then the European Economic Community, the EEC. On the left of Labour, it was said that those initials stood for the enrichment of European capitalists, and therefore the party policy was to pull out of the EEC. But a few years later, having lost that election, trade unions in particular were seeing their freedom to act on behalf of their members, I won't say whittled away, stripped away would be a better way to put it, by the then Thatcher government. And who should turn up at the Trade Union Congress but the then President of the European Commission, Jacques Delors, or as the satirical magazine Private Eye always called him, Zoutalor. And he made a speech to the TUC where he set out the plan whereby British trade unionists would regain, through the European community, or the European Union as it later became, the rights that they had lost under Thatcher. So where those rights had been won through industrial action in the first place, in historical terms, now they were going to be restored by regulation. And that speech became known as the Frère Jacques speech, and that was as responsible as anything for converting Labour to be the European party it is today. So that is an essential point, I think, about the character of the European Union, which is not abundantly well understood in most of the British debate, discourse on the subject, or what passes for it. And that lack of understanding really is responsible for some of the blockages that the government of Theresa May has encountered in trying to promulgate her so-called deal to leave the EU. It is said that Theresa May's first Brexit Secretary of State, the Secretary of State at the Department for Exiting the European Union, first incumbent of that newly created position, David Davis, turned up in Brussels for his initial meeting with Michel Barnier, and it is said that Barnier said to him, "So, Mr. Davis, what are you going to do about the shared land border between the UK and the EU?" And Davis went, what land border? What are you talking about? And of course, it's the land border in Ireland. So people like David Davis had gone around throughout the referendum campaign promising how great it would be once Britain was free to strike its own trade deals. Britain would be free to strike its own trade deals. It would be, it wouldn't be shackled to the retrograde, over-regulated, dozy old European Union anymore. It would be restored to the kind of buccaneering spirit of the waves. Francis Drake singed the King of Spain's beard, going it alone, all these kind of references. And of course, top of the list for a free trade deal by a post-Brexit United Kingdom would be with the United States. Why not? The world's richest country, the world's biggest trading nation, and so forth. Now, here's the thing. Britain could have a free trade deal with the United States on the same terms that any country can always have a free trade deal with the United States by agreeing to everything America says. If you agree to America's list of demands, then you're welcome to have a free trade deal. So Britain would be very welcome to have a free trade deal. And of course, those lists of demands are topped by the stipulation that any free trade deal must provide for unhindered market access for American agricultural produce. That's always top of the list. America has a huge overproduction of certain strategic agricultural produce, and they would like nothing better than to add a fairly large, wealthy market, such as the United Kingdom, to the list of territories where they can have unhindered market access. And of course, one of the most important of these agricultural products is beef. Legendary English roast beef, that's what the French call us, le roast beef, would be a very apt context in which America could extend the market access for its beef. But it does have a certain snag from a European Union point of view, which is that America produces hormone-treated beef. Of course, in Australia, we know nothing about that. But you know, if you inject hormones into a steer, then it can be ready for slaughter in 2 years, whereas if you don't, it will take 4 years. So that's a huge economic impact on the industry. And of course, the hormones can only bring about that effect on the body of the animal by entering into its metabolism. And that means that when we eat the meat of the animal, the hormones also enter our metabolism. Now, the endocrine system is a system in the body that has a lifelong strategy. That's why some of us have noticed a few changes over the years, perhaps some more than others. But it has a lifelong strategy. So the point is, we would only know if that pattern of consumption was any good for us once we had expended a period where large numbers of people had spent their whole lives eating it and then consented to be tested for the effects. In other words, it's impossible to know whether it's doing us any good or any harm. And so the European Union excludes hormone-treated beef on the precautionary principle. Precautionary principle.
That's good.
So here's where we come back to Monsieur Barnier's question: what does Britain propose to do about the land border between the EU and the UK? Because that border across the island of Ireland has, of course, been effectively lifted when both territories have been EU members, and that has been an unalloyed good thing. It's perhaps the major underpinning of the altogether less violent and more hopeful phase of the conflict in and over the island of Ireland involving the Irish and the British. So nobody wants the hard border to be brought back. In fact, Britain is committed to avoiding the restoration of a hard border in the Good Friday Agreement, which is a solemn binding international treaty, also involving the United States, by the way. And if a hard border were to be restored, then there would inevitably be border installations. Those installations would inevitably be targeted. There would inevitably be smuggling. Smuggling would inevitably seek the protection of paramilitaries, and all of a sudden we'd be back in the period of the Troubles. So these are the kind of reasons people want to avoid it. But here's the thing: if you don't have a border between Northern Ireland, which is part of the UK, post-Brexit, and the Republic of Ireland, which is part of the European Union, what do? Because you can't have a situation where people can import hormone-treated beef from the United States into Northern Ireland and then simply load it onto trucks and trundle it across the border into the Republic, because then it's in the European Union. And the EU's external trade policy has gone for a burn. This is the reason for the famous or infamous backstop. You see, Stuart and I have decided to adopt these characters for the night: Backstop and Brino. Brino, by the way, it sounds like a nickname for any Australian man called Brian, doesn't it? Here we are, good day, Brino, here you go. Actually, no, it's one of the variants of Brexit. It's called Brexit in name only. It's also known as Hotel California Brexit. You can check out any time you like and never leave. And that's because the obvious remedy for this dilemma of the Irish border is not to remove Britain from the EU customs union, but instead to stay in the customs union, which forecloses the possibility of striking any independent trade deals.
Yes.
So if there's no possibility to strike any independent trade deals, what's the point? That's a Brexit in name only. Now, this is the kind of reason why Theresa May has had such difficulty in getting her deal through the House of Commons, because it has this backstop attached to it. And the backstop is supposed to apply not only to Northern Ireland, but also to the rest of the UK. So in other words, if there's no new trade deal between Britain and the EU within a two-year period, then as a backstop, the same customs regime will apply to the whole of the UK as it does at the moment. Not just to Northern Ireland. It was intended to be just to Northern Ireland, but then the Tories started to get problems from their de facto coalition partners in the Democratic Unionist Party. Let me digress and tell you a bit about the Democratic Unionist Party. It was the party associated with the late Reverend Ian Paisley. Remember him? There will be a wailing and a gnashing of teeth, he would say. The little old man in the front would go, but you haven't got any teeth. Teeth will be provided. That's the kind of thing, okay? So they're terribly fierce. I mean, they'll be very fierce on what we see here. The devil's nectar is what they're drinking, these people here, right? It's famous or infamous as the most socially regressive political party in the United Kingdom. Strangely, you may think, the Democratic Unionist Party received a mysterious donation of £434,000 some months before the Brexit referendum to spend on campaigning for a Leave vote, of which only £2,000 was actually spent in Northern Ireland. £432,000 was spent on the British mainland campaigning for a Leave vote. And here's a quirk. In the UK, although Britain's electoral laws and regulations are in urgent need of an overhaul, Brexit has shown us that, if nothing else, generally speaking, political parties are obliged to disclose the source of their funding, but it doesn't apply in Northern Ireland. And the rationale at the time was to insulate donors to political parties against reprisals. So now it's a loophole. Someone's taken advantage of that loophole. We still don't know who gave them it, to donate nearly £500,000 to the Democratic Unionists to spend on advertising for a Leave vote. It's all highly mysterious and highly dodgy. Anyway, the DUP declared that they would not countenance any arrangement which would institute different arrangements for Northern Ireland compared with the rest of the United Kingdom, and therefore the backstop, I'll be backstop, you be Brino, the backstop had to be extended not merely to the province itself but also across the rest of the UK. And that's what has cost Mrs May support in the House of Commons, where she has looked for it for her deal. Because people look forward and they say to themselves, well, only if we reach an agreement with the EU will we be able to get out from the backstop. So until we reach that agreement with the EU, which requires them to agree with us, we will be stuck with the same trading regime as we have now, and that will defeat the point of Brexit. Now, I should say something about Jeremy Corbyn. Woo! Jeremy Corbyn, you can have a little kind of, imagine a little pub quiz question. Name one leader of a party of government in any OECD country in the past 25 years with any track record of speaking out for the rights of Palestinians. I've got a list here. Here's my list. A little list here. Woo! List, ready? Jeremy Corbyn. And moreover, Jeremy Corbyn dares to take issue with the orthodoxies of neoliberalism in economic policy and neoconservatism in foreign policy, striking a chord, let it be said, with the wider public, but infuriating the British establishment. So Jeremy Corbyn is in a very difficult position. Some of his MPs sit for constituencies where large majorities of people voted to leave the EU. One of them, Lisa Nandy, the MP for Wigan, was writing in The Guardian last week about people wanting to take back control. That was the infamous slogan, the furphy of the Leave campaign. But as I've just been explaining, at the moment Britain has control over the importation of hormone-injected beef, and Brexit would see it abruptly lose that control. At the moment, Britain can join the EU in raising human rights stipulations when it comes to trading with countries from Saudi Arabia to Sri Lanka, which it's done in both cases in the recent past. But post-Brexit, of course, the UK would be a complete supplicant. You know, it's the old adage of international trade negotiations, they're like a shit sandwich. The less bread you've got, the more shit you have to eat. And that would be the way of it for the UK post-Brexit, without doubt. So that's a complete furphy, but Jeremy Corbyn, I think, still partly harks back to the old left scepticism about the EU project. So he is disappointed many people by playing this Sphinx-like or Janus-like role. Still, I can record, I'm certainly no maven of social media, but the single Facebook post I've ever created that enjoyed more likes than any other was a picture I took of us at the March for a People's Vote in London last September. I was supposed to attract 100,000 people, but it actually attracted 700,000. And it was said that branches of the Waitrose upmarket grocery chain around the country was strangely quiet that afternoon. But this Saturday, unfortunately, I can't be there in person, but it promises to be bigger still, a demonstration for a People's Vote. And this is one way in which Britain might now avoid or avert the disaster of a no-deal Brexit, because there is an amendment tabled by two Labour MPs, Kyle and Wilson, to attach to the deal proposed by the Prime Minister a provision that it is then put to a second referendum. And if that were to take place, it's highly likely that she would be offered sex and travel by the British people, and that we would actually end up remaining, which has been the aim of some of us all along. I would put the percentage likelihood of that coming to pass over the next few days, crunch time, at about 30%. It's probably slightly more likely that we will have a no-deal Brexit, and Labour will at least be left with the consolation of being able to blame it on the Tories.
Yay!
And let's face it, there's always some pleasure in that.